Okay, this video is a book review. Here is the book, The High Blood Pressure Solution by Richard Moore, MD, PhD. This is a brilliant book. It's one of the best medical books I ever read. And this guy spent over 40 years studying plasma membrane ion pumps to better understand hypertension. So it's the best book ever written on hypertension. And I think that's kind of the way it works is, if you want to become an expert, when a real true expert writes something, you want to absorb it as well as you can. I read this book 3 times cover to cover, and you can see I put tons of post-it notes on there. I went through it a bunch of times. I'll summarize it on the inner leaflet of the book. I'll summarize some of it on the back of the book. And I wanted to really make sure that I understood what was in this book because it's really foundational for how a plasma membrane works. Okay, so here's the book. You can still buy it. It's a great book if you want to buy High Blood Pressure Solution. Came out in about 2001. Okay, now we're going to go through some of the information in there. A couple of papers that are relevant to it. I'll show you these papers first. This guy right here, Louis Dahl, was a friend of the author of the book, and it starts with Kempner. Kempner was producing these remarkable papers, unbelievable, in the 1940s. Okay, this paper right here was later written in 1972 by Louis Dahl. He was another researcher of plasma membrane ion pumps and sodium. And he said when he saw Kempner's work in 1948, it was so extraordinary that he decided he wanted to study it. And he also was shocked right here. You can see here, I'll read you the paragraph by him. For reasons that are difficult to fathom, there appeared to be a great deal of antipathy to Kempner's reports, as well as irrational disbelief in the effectiveness of his rice diet. In a major review of the subject early in 1949, it was even stated that the suggestion had not been ruled out. It was even stated that suggestion had not been ruled out, that they're saying that Kempner lied, okay? And then restriction of salt intake, the conclusion of these papers that had evaluated his work was that it has not been independently shown to be capable of lowering the blood pressure in hypertensive patients. So these guys believed Kempner. Other people, his colleagues, did not believe him. And they went out to test it. And they actually spent 4 years testing, and they came to the conclusion Kempner exactly told the truth, okay? And so he says, then their antipathies started being pushed towards him, this guy Louis Dahl. And then I mentioned Louis Dahl because he was one of the heroes to the author of this book, Richard Moore. Okay, and they were amazed at how low in sodium, high in potassium the diet was. Very different than the conventional person was eating in those days. High-fat diet, hamburgers and all that stuff. And they confirmed that the blood pressure lowering effect was primarily due to the low amount of dietary sodium. But as we're going to get into more, it's more than just low sodium. It's also having a high dietary potassium. And of course, where does that pattern come from? From plants. Oh, and there's another paper in here I wanted to show you. I'll show you here. I got to move myself. All right, we got it now. So here's the other paper I wanted to show you. I got to grab myself here and move. It's Treatment of Hypertension Disease with the Rice Diet by Walter Kempner. Just to get an idea how low this diet is. He says, first of all, the rice, fruit, and sugar diet is more rigid than any of the other diets, fat poor, salt poor, or protein poor diets for treating hypertension or kidney failure. The rice diet contains only 2,000 calories, not more than 5 grams of fat, and about 20 grams of protein. So super low in fat and protein. And then not more than 200 milligrams of calories. Only 150 milligrams of sodium. And even some of his patients, he would get them below that, 60 milligrams of sodium. So those extraordinarily low amounts of sodium. And the rice was boiled or steamed. All right, that's kind of what got everybody excited. Now we're going to talk just a little bit about electrolytes. There's a few things you need to know about electrolytes. Not much, but there's a couple things you do need to know. Okay, that the way to think of it is think of like the ocean. So theoretically, God made life and he started it in the ocean. And the ocean's seawater, salt water, is very high in sodium. It's also very high in calcium because it rinses over the rocks made out of limestone. Limestone's like calcium carbonate. So seawater, high in sodium, high in calcium carbonate. You're going to have to remember that because that's going to be the same as the extracellular space. Okay, so in order for a cell to maintain its osmotic shape, it has to always have the same number of positive charges inside of it. in a living cell, about 98% of those charges are from potassium and sodium. So the amount of potassium and sodium in a cell, Na plus K is always equal to a constant. It's always the same, and it has to be that way to maintain the osmotic shape of the cell so it doesn't swell and die. All right, so what I'm saying is, for life first to occur on Earth, God had to make a way to pump out the sodium and to pump out the calcium. And you're always pumping against a gradient to do that, so you had to use ATP. But if you remember that idea of salt water and limestone are outside the cell, therefore they're high outside the cell in calcium and in sodium, that'll serve you very well to understand all the rest of this stuff. The concentration of sodium outside the cell is about 10 times what it is inside the cell. And the opposite is true for potassium. It's very high inside the cell. Potassium is the most common ion in the cell. So I'll show you in a picture what that all means some more. But so here's a cell. I don't know how I ended up with this new mouse. All right, so here's a potassium-sodium ATP pump. And it requires an ATP. It takes in 2 potassium, so that's a positive charge of 2, but it pumps out 3 sodium, so that's a positive charge, 3 positive charges going out. Because there's a net positive charge going out, that means you have a positive current exiting the cell cytoplasm. Cell cytoplasm is in here. Okay, and the cell typically uses about 25% to 1/3 of its energy to run this pump. In a neuron, it'll be like half to 2/3 of its energy goes to run that pump. Because you're pumping out more positive charge, you're pumping current, positive charge current going out. The Na plus K plus pump here is the electrical generator. And it separates charge across the plasma membrane, which can be used to generate a current. So that's a battery by definition. And sodium's carrying the current, so it's called a sodium battery. The charge inside the cell is typically negative 65 millivolts. Okay, so the reason you ramp up this electrical charge, create a battery, is so that you can then use that battery for energy to pump stuff. I'm trying to move myself here. All right, anyways, I can't do it. So once you've got this gradient, it's electrochemical gradient. It's chemical because you have a concentration gradient of sodium outside relative to inside of about 10. Then you have an electrical gradient because the charge inside the cell is negative 65 millivolts. So the sodium wants to come into the cell. And the way I describe these ions is potassium and magnesium are the middle class trying to make things work. They're good, okay? Calcium is a big aristocrat who bosses everybody around and who's not reasonable. Sodium is the angry poor trying to get into the city. It really wants to come into the cell. Okay, we'll get back to that all, but that's all going to make sense. I'm going through this stuff real quick here so that when I read the book's pretty sophisticated, you'll have the general idea. You have to know the stuff I'm talking about here. That the total concentration of potassium and sodium inside a cell is constant. And that's over 98% of the cations, the positively charged ions inside a cell. And so whenever one goes up, it's a zero-sum game. The other has to go down. So if potassium comes up, sodium will go down. Okay, and we talked about in a recent talk that our kidneys are designed to excrete lots of potassium, tons and tons of potassium they'll excrete. And it makes sense. You think some of these fruits are like 500 times more potassium than sodium because it's an intracellular ion, so they'll keep it with them. All right, so that's always going to be constant, the amount. Okay, what are some of the other things interesting about that? Well, that's the key thing. If you eat too much dietary salt, what happens is then you start getting more salt inside the cell and you start getting rid of potassium, and your net bodily stores of potassium will go down because whenever one goes up, the other goes down. And our ancestors ate tons and tons of sodium, and the kidney could handle it by excreting all the extra. But in the modern world, we eat more sodium than potassium, and that leads to all kinds of problems. Every cell tends to be overloaded with sodium. When the sodium's overloaded, then you don't have as strong a gradient of sodium so that you can't run your calcium pumps as effectively, and calcium starts to rise in its concentration inside the cell cytoplasm. When calcium goes up in the cell cytoplasm, it's the activator ion, like the aristocrat, that bosses everything else around. It gets these cells to do whatever they're designed to do. So it makes the smooth muscle cells contract and cause vasoconstriction, narrowing of the blood vessel. It makes the insulin secreting cells release insulin. Okay. And in the brain cells, it causes excitability. It makes them increases their activity level. Let's leave it at that. Okay, here's just one paper, kind of shows what we were talking about in more detail. When calcium comes into the cell, it'll make the cell constrict. Okay. If norepinephrine binds to it or angiotensin II, they'll make it constrict. Nitric oxide makes the vascular smooth muscle dilate. Okay, here's a typical cell in more detail. And so what you're seeing here is the concentration of calcium outside the cell is about 10,000 times what it is inside the cell. And normally the calcium should only come in briefly, exert an effect, and then be removed real fast. This sodium calcium exchanger can excrete like 5,000 calcium ions per second, so it's incredibly fast. So here's the Kn ATPase again, potassium sodium ATPase. You're pumping more calcium out, a current going outward. You build up more charge of positive sodiums outside the cell than inside the cell. You can couple the entry of sodium into the cell to pump calcium out with a knockout exchanger. Okay, and that's how the cell does its business. And this is the only thing that pumps sodium out and establishes the battery. Everything else brings sodium in to move amino acids in or to move protons out. Okay, in a neuron, what will happen is the high calcium in cytoplasm will cause the cell to release its neurotransmitter. Okay, so here's a normal artery right here. Here's a vasoconstricted artery. Here would be a vasodilated artery. Things that will cause vasoconstriction are anything that inhibits endothelial nitric oxides. Things like sodium, things like uric acid, a sympathetic, through the noradrenaline, adrenaline receptors. The ratio of potassium to sodium is called the K factor, and you always want that greater than 5. Ideally, our ancestors ate about 15 or 20 to 1. So the more plants you eat, the more potassium you'll get, and the higher your K factor will be, and the less likely you'll be to have hypertension. So K factor, again, is the ratio of potassium to sodium. Okay, here is magnesium. You can see it's in the center of chlorophyll, so you get it from eating plants. And you need magnesium to maintain your potassium levels. They go hand in hand. All the ATPs have a magnesium bound to the second and the third phosphate to keep it from breaking apart early, so you can get usable energy out of it. Endothelial cells are spindle-shaped, and they're orientated on the long axis of the main direction of blood flow, of laminar flow. Okay, the main thing the endothelial cells do is they make nitric oxide. It goes into the lumen. It's a gas. It diffuses over there to block platelets from clotting. It goes into the smooth muscle wall, into the smooth muscle, and it causes them to vasodilate. Okay, I'm going to go into a little more detail here. The fact that the human kidney is designed to excrete potassium and to conserve sodium is further evidence that humans are designed to eat plants. I mean, it makes sense. That matches our body physiology to what is our ancestral diet. And then here's a line by Moore. Nature gives us no choice. We must have enough potassium for our bodily cells to work properly. Yeah, so the only place you're going to get all that potassium conveniently is from plants. There is pretty decent potassium in meat. Meat might be about K factor of 4, but these fruits are in the hundreds pretty routinely. Okay, what he says is that blood pressure, hypertension is just a symptom of having the potassium-sodium balance out of whack. He says about 80% of strokes long-term are due to hypertension. But nobody in the medical community is challenging the conclusions of his book, okay, because they know he's right. 6 different independent lines of evidence showing that this K factor is the key to hypertension. The anthropologists, whenever they study a primitive culture, none of them ever have hypertension. And you can avoid hypertension even if you eat a lot of meat, if you don't eat anything else bad, because it has a K factor about 4, 4.5. Vegetarians with a high K factor, they almost never get hypertensive. Animal studies showing increasing K factor levels lowers blood pressure and helps prevent strokes. Clinical experience with humans shows that increasing K factor lowers blood pressure, prevents much stroke, so with individual people. He, by the way, like I said, was a big admirer of Walter Kempner. We're going to go through the anthropology, epidemiology studies in a moment. Biophysical research shows that every cell has an electrical system with potassium and sodium used for normal homeostasis. Okay, so here's some of the anthropology. They found that none of the primitive populations, even the ones that eat a lot of meat, were hypertensive. And it's thought that they weren't that hypertensive because they weren't adding dietary salt to it. You know, in that wild grass caught hunted meat, it's going to have less fat. So they couldn't find any primitive populations eating their traditional whole food diet that were hypertensive, indicating it's a cultural disease. It's not a genetic disease. Okay, the Yanomamo in South America, Amazon jungle, they live very violent lives. They're always fighting with their neighbors. But despite all the stress of that, they don't have any hypertension. So the diet's a lot more important than psychological stress. Well, there was a book written about the Western diseases called And Their Emergence and Prevention by Dennis Burkitt and Trowell. Okay, and the Africans and Ugandans, you know, the USA blacks have way more hypertension than anybody else. As a matter of fact, the USA blacks, they're 18 times more likely to die from hypertension-related kidney failure than the whites. But when you go to Africa with plant-based communities like the Kenyans and other populations in South Africa, Uganda, they don't really have that much hypertension. Okay, of course we know the Tarahumara versus the Pima. In northern Mexico, the Tarahumara, Sierra Madre, Copper Canyon Mountains, they're ultra-marathoners, you know, because they eat their old plant-based diet. Pritikin was so impressed by them, he patterned his diet after them. I mean, they could run up to 200 miles in 2 days playing this kickball game. They don't have any known heart disease. They eat corn, beans, squash, chili peppers, local greens. A very low-fat diet that's also quite high in fiber. Okay, Loma Linda, Seventh-day Adventists, they're relatively healthy. Okinawans, quite healthy. They study them very closely. Papua New Guinea with the sweet potatoes. China, when they ate the white rice, they used to be healthy. Finland, when they switched to potassium chloride and they ate lower fat diets, more fruits and veggies year-round. The Aita people of the Solomon Islands, Australian Aborigines, Botswana natives, Karajas, Indians in Panama. Japanese with same salt but more potassium intake have lower blood pressure, let's say, than some other group that had similar salt intake but didn't eat the veggies. Okay, the clincher too is that in the modern, and there's also migration studies, the more people migrate towards the Western world and eat more salt and more fat, the more hypertensive they get. And the other clincher was, he said, vegetarians virtually eliminates hypertension, especially if you're eating low-fat vegan. You're real unlikely. You're going to have a K factor really high ratio of dietary potassium to sodium. Okay, here's a famous paper. This is a Donison paper, C.P. Donison from The Lancet, 1929. The title of the paper is Blood Pressure in the African Native. Its bearing on the etiology, cause of hyperpesia, hypertension, and arterial sclerosis, atherosclerosis. The key point was that they measured the blood pressure on 1,800 consecutive admissions to the hospital of adults, and there was no hypertension, not a single patient. In the USA, if you measured all the blacks being admitted to a hospital, an adult hospital for hypertension, about 80% of them would be hypertensive. But over there, not a single patient was. That's because they ate a plant-based diet in Kenya. Okay, I think I'm going to stop and call this part 1, and then I'll do the remainder of it. So this is part 1 of the book report on high blood pressure solution. We're going to go into a lot more detail in part 2.